In the year 2205, the Galactic Alliance, a union of thousands of species spanning across dozens of star systems, faced the inevitable defeat. For centuries, the Alliance had maintained peace and order, a shining example of cooperation and diplomacy. But now, in the wake of relentless warfare, the once proud coalition was buckling under the weight of its enemies, an unstoppable, relentless force known as the Zarvok Dominion. The Zarvok, a brutal and technologically advanced species, had ravaged system after system, leaving only scorched remains in their wake. For years, the Alliance had attempted to counter their sheer might with diplomacy and overwhelming numbers, but the Dominion was always one step ahead, outmatching every strategy, every tactic. The leaders of the Alliance had convened in the most secure chamber of their flagship, the Admiral Valeron, orbiting a distant world known as Therax 12. The mood was one of despair, as the war dragged on with no signs of progress. Desperate whispers of surrender had begun to circulate. "Once the Zarvok reach the core systems, we will be utterly wiped out," muttered Supreme Commander Velrith, his voice cracking under the strain of their situation. "All our allies are either dead or conquered. It's only a matter of time before we fall." "Can we not negotiate?" asked General Creel, the Alliance's leading strategist. "Perhaps there's a way to appease the Zarvok. A ceasefire or some other offer." "We've tried," Velrith snapped, his patience fraying. "The Zarvok only understand one thing, destruction. And I fear that our strength will be utterly broken before we can convince them of anything." There was a long, pregnant silence as the officers around the table exchanged glances. One by one, their gazes turned to the figure standing at the far end of the room, Captain Adrian Vance, a human officer of remarkable repute. Though humanity was only one of the many species in the Alliance, their warriors had quickly gained recognition for their unmatched fighting prowess and ruthless efficiency in battle. Vance, in particular, had become a living legend in his own right. Vance was known for his cold, calculating demeanor and his ability to turn the tide of nearly every battle he fought in. He was the only officer in the Alliance who hadn't lost a battle to the Zarvok. And though his methods were sometimes unconventional, there was no question that his presence was the one thing keeping the last remaining resistance from collapsing entirely. "You've been quiet, Captain," Velrith said, his tone almost accusing. "What do you suggest we do? What's left to fight for? The Alliance is finished." Vance stood still, his gaze unwavering. His thoughts were far from the table's politics. He was calculating the next moves, the next strategies, the ones that would defy the overwhelming odds. "The Alliance may be finished," Vance said, his voice cool and emotionless. "But humanity isn't. And we don't go down quietly. We fight, we strike, and we win." There was a moment of disbelief at his words. "Are you suggesting a last stand?" Creel asked, shaking his head. "I'm suggesting we do what humans do best," Vance replied, his lips curling into a grim smile. "We push back. We don't surrender. And we teach the Zarvok that humanity has no intention of being crushed by anyone. Not today. Not ever." Velrith's brow furrowed. "You speak of defiance, but with what? The entire galaxy is falling to the Zarvok. We have no resources left. No fleets. No reinforcements. They've beaten us at every turn." Vance turned toward the display screen and activated a series of holograms that detailed the ongoing battles across the galaxy. He highlighted the Zarvok strengths, their overwhelming numbers, their devastating weapons, their ruthlessness. But then he pointed to something else. The hologram shifted, revealing a scattered group of ships, the remnants of the human fleet, still scattered across the galaxy, far from defeated, but far from united. These ships, while limited, were equipped with technology unknown to the rest of the Alliance, remnants of secret experiments humanity had undertaken during the early days of the war. "We don't need to defeat the Zarvok in a conventional sense," Vance continued. "We need to strike at their core. Their fleets are formidable, but they aren't invulnerable. If we can rally what's left of humanity's warriors and hit them where they least expect it, we can turn this war around." A murmur spread across the room. It was clear to everyone that Vance had a plan, But it would take something more than just military strategy to pull it off. It would require a level of ruthlessness that no one in the Alliance had dared to consider. A final, desperate gamble. Velrith leaned back, considering the captain's words. I don't like it. But if there's even a sliver of a chance, we have no other choice. The decision was made. Humanity, the galaxy's most audacious and relentless fighters, would strike back, no matter the cost. They would bring the war to the Zarvok on their own terms. And thus, the last stand of the human race began. The first step in Vance's plan was deceptively simple. Unite humanity's scattered forces. The remnants of the human fleet were not a single, cohesive force anymore. After years of retreating and evading the Zarvok's crushing blows, humanity's ships were scattered across the galaxy in a fractured web of isolated pockets. Some were trapped in hostile systems. Others were stranded on planets that had been abandoned or overrun. Only a handful of these forces had managed to survive the unrelenting onslaught. But despite their dire straits, they all shared one thing, a relentless will to fight. Vance's mission was to bring them together. He and his most trusted officers, including Captain Arya Haywood, a veteran of numerous campaigns, and Lieutenant Mark Grayson, a tactical genius, began to map out a route across the galaxy. The plan was to first gather the most experienced combatants, those with the skills necessary to make any retaliation feasible. Each of these fleet captains had their own pride, their own reasons for continuing the fight, but they were all losing hope. One of the first ships Vance and his team made contact with was the Thundering Justice, a heavily damaged warship led by Captain Yannick Riker. Riker's fleet had once been a symbol of humanity's strength, but after losing countless battles, Riker had turned into something of a recluse, hiding out in the remote sectors of the galaxy, hoping for a miracle. We've got nothing left, Riker grumbled when Vance's message came through, his voice rough and bitter. Not a ship, not a crew, not even enough fuel to make it to the next system. What do you want from me, Vance? I want you to remember who we are, Riker. Vance's voice came through, calm but insistent. You led humanity's fleet in the early days of this war. You're one of the best, and I need you to come back. The Zarvok aren't unstoppable. They're just stronger, but not unbeatable. Riker's response was a hollow laugh. Stronger? They've torn through everything we've ever built. Do you think a few ships, half of which are held together with duct tape, are going to change the tide of this war? Yes, Vance said firmly. And if you don't help me now, humanity is as good as dead. The Alliance is done, but we're not. Come back to the fight. There was silence on the other end of the comms. After what seemed like an eternity, Riker sighed. All right, damn you, Vance. You've always had a way of making people do stupid things. I'll be there, but don't expect a miracle. Riker wasn't the only one Vance had to convince. Over the next few weeks, he reached out to various other captains, commanders, and warlords, convincing them one by one to unite under his banner. They came, some reluctantly, others more fervently. They were a ragtag collection of ships, old and new, military-grade and makeshift, each with their own set of skills and stories. And each captain had their doubts, some openly voicing concerns that their small fleets could do nothing against the Zarvok's unrelenting might. At first, the group came together out of necessity, but Vance's leadership had a way of forging them into something more. With every new ship that joined the cause, the tiny spark of resistance began to ignite once more. As the fleet grew, Vance's plans began to take shape, each layer of his strategy more audacious than the last. But still, doubts lingered. On board the flagship, the Dark Fury, Arya Haywood stood with Vance, staring out at the stars. The room was quiet, the hum of the engines beneath their feet the only sound. You know they're not all with us, right? Arya asked, her voice low, though not out of doubt. Some of these captains are only here because they have nowhere else to go. We're asking them to follow us into the unknown. They've seen too much loss to have faith in anything anymore. Vance turned to her, his face as cold and unreadable as ever. I didn't ask them to follow. I asked them to fight. That's what we do, Haywood. We fight. We never stop fighting. She nodded, though a shadow of doubt flickered in her eyes. It's a hell of a gamble. We're humanity, Arya, Vance said, his tone sharpening. We don't gamble. We win. But even as he said the words, something gnawed at the back of his mind. He knew how fragile their alliance was. They had no resources, no full fleets, and no central command. Only sheer willpower and the burning desire to stop the Zarvok from grinding humanity into dust. But that fire, that hunger for revenge, that was something the Zarvok couldn't understand. The Dominion could outfight them, but they could never match humanity's resilience. And Vance was determined to prove it. As the last of humanity's scattered fleets came together under Vance's command, the tension aboard the ships was palpable. The Dark Fury had become the new flagship, and in its hull, the remnants of humanity's fiercest warriors and most experienced officers began to prepare for their first strike against the Zarvok. Vance's plan was audacious, almost suicidal in its scope, but it was the only way to even have a chance of turning the tide of the war. For weeks, the fleet moved under the radar, careful not to draw attention to its regrouping forces. Every ship was a patched-up relic, each one carrying a history of brutal engagements, failures, and, for many, a sense of unfulfilled vengeance. Yet there was a quiet resolve in their eyes, a shared understanding that they had no choice but to strike first if they were to survive. Captain Riker of the Thundering Justice was the first to break the silence, arriving in the war room aboard the Dark Fury. He had been among the hardest to convince, but his presence now was invaluable. Despite his rough exterior and bitter demeanor, there was no question about his combat abilities. Riker was a master tactician, and humanity needed him. "You've got to be out of your damn mind," Riker grumbled, standing in front of the holographic display. His eyes scanned the map, his fingers hovering over the tactical grid of the Zarvok's supply lines. Vance's lips twitched into a grim smile. "I didn't ask you to approve it, Captain. I asked you to lead it." Riker scowled, his hand slamming down onto the table. "Lead what exactly? This? You're asking us to take a handful of ships and punch a hole through the heart of Zarvok territory? You've got less than half of what you need to even scratch their surface. You might as well ask us to charge into a black hole." "And yet," Vance replied, "we're still going to do it." Grayson, who had been quiet until now, looked up. "The objective is simple, Riker. The Zarvok are securing resources in the Quadrant 47 system, a vital supply chain for their war machine. We hit them there, disrupt their supply lines, and buy ourselves time." Haywood, standing beside Vance, crossed her arms. "But hitting them, there isn't just about supplies. If we break their infrastructure, we shake their confidence. The Zarvok think they're unstoppable. This will show them they're not." Riker rubbed his temples, clearly torn. "You want to disrupt their supply chain. And what? Hope that they'll retreat in terror? You can't win this war on a few raids." "We don't need to win the war right now," Vance said, voice steady. "We need to make them bleed. A little pain, a little chaos. That's how we get their attention. And once we have that, we'll build on it." The plan was simple. Strike quickly, strike hard, and strike with precision. The Dark Fury and its accompanying fleet would infiltrate the outskirts of the Zarvok-controlled Quadrant 47, bypassing their outer defenses with a series of stealthy, hit-and-run tactics. Once inside, they would target key resource facilities, mining operations, fuel depots, and shipyards, anything that would disrupt the Zarvok's war effort. Vance knew the risks. They wouldn't be able to match the Zarvok in terms of sheer firepower. The plan depended on speed, surprise, and most importantly, the element of chaos. The more they could disrupt, the more the Zarvok would be forced to divide their attention. But nothing was guaranteed. If even one ship faltered, the entire mission would collapse, and humanity's fragile fleet would be obliterated in the blink of an eye. The day of the strike arrived faster than anyone expected. The fleet jumped into the system under the cover of darkness, avoiding long-range scanners and flying under the radar of the Zarvok's outer patrols. It was a gamble, and the tension in the air was suffocating. As they approached their target, the fleet split into smaller groups, each captain taking their designated position. On the Dark Fury, Vance stood at the command center, watching the fleet's progress on the tactical display. His mind was a storm of calculations. Every decision, every movement, every action would dictate the outcome. "All units in position," Arya reported, her voice calm despite the palpable tension. "We're ready." Vance nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Initiate Phase 1. We're going to hit them hard and fast." The first strike was brutal. The human fleet emerged from the shadows, descending upon the Zarvok's mining facilities like a sudden storm. The Dark Fury unleashed its heavy artillery, cutting through enemy defenses with precision. Riker's ship, the Thundering Justice, led the charge, its cannons roaring as they tore into the mining colony's infrastructure. The Zarvok, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. Their heavy warships emerged from their stations, launching counterattacks. But the humans had already planted the seeds of chaos. A dozen ships moved like ghosts, striking key targets, and then vanishing into the shadows before the Zarvok could retaliate. The destruction was swift, ruthless, and total. Vance watched the chaos unfold from the command deck. A wicked smile curled at the edge of his lips. For the first time in years, humanity was on the offensive. "Phase 1 complete," Grayson reported. "The Zarvok are in disarray. They're pulling their fleets back to protect the core systems." "Good," Vance replied, his voice cold and resolute. "Now we make them bleed." But as the battle raged on, Vance couldn't shake the feeling that the Zarvok were only just beginning to realize the danger. The first blow had been struck, but the true fight was only just beginning. The thrill of the first successful strike against the Zarvok was short-lived. Within hours of the human fleet's initial assault, the Dominion responded with a fury unlike anything the survivors of humanity's fleet had seen before. The scattered, ragtag group of ships was still reeling from the shock of their initial success when the Zarvok's counterattack came crashing down. From the depths of their territory, the Zarvok unleashed their full wrath, massive warships, their dark hulls gleaming with deadly precision, warped into the quadrant. The human fleet had caught them off guard, but now the Dominion had mobilized their most elite units. And they weren't about to let some insignificant resistance group disrupt their war machine. Vance watched the tactical display with steely eyes, his hands clenched into fists. They had known retaliation was inevitable, but the speed and ferocity of the Zarvok's response was staggering. Already, enemy ships were flooding into the system at an alarming rate, their sleek forms cutting through the void with terrifying efficiency. "Captain Vance," Haywood's voice broke through the tension. "We're facing the full might of their battle fleets. They've dispatched 3 Dreadnought-class ships. The Vector, Dracther, and Aldrak, these are their heavy hitters." Vance's eyes narrowed. The Dreadnought-class ships were the pride of the Zarvok Navy, immense, heavily armed, and practically invulnerable to most conventional attacks. Taking them down would require more than just cunning. It would take every bit of humanity's defiance, every ounce of ruthlessness they could muster. "We don't stand a chance in a straight-up fight," Riker growled, pacing behind them. "Not with those dreadnoughts in play." "We won't fight them head-on," Vance said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "The mission was never about a direct confrontation. It's about hitting them where it hurts and making them regret underestimating us. We can't stop the dreadnoughts, but we can cripple their resources and force them to scatter their fleet." Grayson's voice crackled from the communication line. "Phase 2 of the strike is complete. We've sabotaged their supply routes and crippled their fuel depots, but it's a temporary fix. They'll regroup quickly." Vance's mind raced through the possibilities. The key was not to waste their limited resources in a losing battle. They had only one advantage: speed. Surprise. Humanity had always been known for their adaptability, for thinking outside the box when it came to war. And now, they would have to use that to its fullest extent. "Haywood, Riker, I need you to prepare a diversion, something that will force them to split their forces. Grayson, deploy our decoys. We'll use the Dark Fury as bait. We'll pull their dreadnoughts into a trap." "What kind of trap?" Haywood asked, her brow furrowing. Vance's lips curled into a fierce grin. "A trap they won't expect. We're going to make them think they've won." The next few hours were a blur of frantic orders, rapid adjustments, and cold precision. The human fleet shifted tactics again and again, maneuvering like a fluid, chaotic organism in response to the Zarvok's overwhelming onslaught. Every ship was assigned a specific role in the plan. Some would play the decoys, others would launch hit-and-run strikes. The Dark Fury would be the centerpiece, drawing the dreadnought's attention and leading them deep into a system where they could finally be ambushed. The Dark Fury, now bristling with hidden traps and laser-guided mines, sped through the galaxy's blackness, its engines cloaked by an advanced stealth system. Behind it, a small fleet of decoy ships moved in erratic patterns, pretending to be fleeing survivors. The Zarvok took the bait. Minutes later, the Dark Fury was in the heart of the system, and the first signs of success began to show. The Zarvok's dreadnoughts had taken the bait and moved in, focusing their firepower on the decoys, desperate to eliminate the perceived threat. Vance watched as the larger ships moved into the trap zone. The human fleet had led them through a gauntlet of gravity wells, asteroid fields, and deep space anomalies. Now, the dreadnoughts were encroaching on a pocket of empty space, where Vance had set the stage for the trap. Now, Vance muttered under his breath. In an instant, the decoys exploded in a series of dazzling fireballs, drawing the attention of the Zarvok warships. As the enemy pursued, the real plan unfolded. A barrage of mines detonated from the hidden corners of the trap zone, sending shockwaves across the area. The Zarvok dreadnoughts, unable to predict the trap, took direct hits from the mines, powerful enough to cripple their sublight engines and disrupt their weapon systems. For a brief moment, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Then came the final part of Vance's plan. Riker's thundering justice and a handful of other ships swooped in from behind the asteroid field, their weapons firing in rapid succession. The dreadnoughts, heavily damaged and disoriented, were caught in a deadly crossfire. The battle raged for what seemed like an eternity, but in the end, the humans had achieved the impossible. The dreadnoughts, though not destroyed outright, were badly crippled, their weapon systems offline, and their engines shattered. The Zarvok fleet was forced to retreat, their superiority in numbers and firepower no match for the calculated fury of humanity's last stand. Vance stood at the command center, watching the retreating enemy ships, his face grim. The battle had been a success, but it came with a price. The Dark Fury had taken substantial damage, and several human ships had been lost in the chaos. "This is only the beginning," Vance said, his voice cold. "The Zarvok will return in force. But for now, we've made our point. Humanity will not be crushed. Not while I still draw breath." The fleet, battered but unbowed, set course for their next target. Victory came at a price. Though the ambush against the Zarvok dreadnoughts had been a significant blow to their war efforts, the human fleet was far from unscathed. The Dark Fury limped into a nearby repair station, its hull riddled with scorch marks and debris from a battle. The crew had sustained casualties, some killed in action, others critically wounded. But even in the face of such loss, there was a glimmer of something the Zarvok had not anticipated: humanity's resolve. Vance stood alone in the war room of the Dark Fury, his eyes focused on the quiet hum of the fleet around him. The room, now empty save for his officers, felt like a hollow echo of its former energy. Even with their victory, the human fleet was still vastly outnumbered and under-equipped. "Captain, the repairs are nearly complete," Haywood reported, breaking the silence as she entered. Her face was gaunt, the weariness from the constant battle evident in her eyes. "But we've lost half our remaining ships, and our resources are running low. We can't afford to keep up these kinds of raids forever." Vance turned, his expression unchanging. "I'm aware, but we can't stop now. The Zarvok are vulnerable, and we need to press them while they're reeling. If we give them time to regroup, we'll never have another shot like this." "We've made our point," Riker's voice came from the doorway, his gruff tone cutting through the tension. "But it's only a matter of time before they call in reinforcements, maybe even their entire fleet. We've been striking at their supply lines, but we're running out of places to hit. Soon, we'll have nowhere left to retreat to." Vance's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with a decisive nod, he addressed the group. "We're not running out of options. We've just been fighting the wrong fight. Haywood raised an eyebrow. What are you suggesting? Vance turned to the display screen, activating a galaxy map. He zoomed in on the heart of Zarvok space, what they called the Zerath Nexus, a heavily fortified system at the core of the Zarvok Dominion. It was their capital, the source of their endless resources, their command hubs, and the birthplace of their war machine. The Nexus, Vance said quietly. The Zarvok's strength lies in their ability to continuously replenish their forces. If we can strike at the heart of their war machine, everything they've built will collapse. We don't need to beat them fleet for fleet. We just need to make them bleed where it hurts the most. But we're talking about a full-on assault against their capital, Riker growled. Even if we manage to get there, we'll be facing every ship they've got. It's suicide. Vance's gaze was unwavering. It's a suicide mission for them, too. If we can hit their factories, disrupt their command centers, and cripple their ability to produce warships and weapons, we'll have put a serious dent in their ability to fight back. The Zarvok have never had to fight without their machines. Let's take that from them. The silence in the room stretched on as the officers processed his words. It was a bold idea, one that was unlikely to succeed, but the only option left for a people who had no intention of being annihilated. This is a one-way trip, Haywood said finally, her voice a mixture of caution and acceptance. If we do this, there's no going back. But if we succeed, we cripple them at their core. We break their will. That's the plan, Vance replied. The preparations for the assault were swift but brutal. Each ship in the human fleet was outfitted with the best weapons and stealth technologies they could afford. Resources were scraped together from the wreckage of their previous battles, and the few remaining engineers worked around the clock, repairing what they could. But even with the best of human ingenuity, the fleet would be massively outgunned and outnumbered by the Zarvok forces waiting in the Zerath Nexus. The Dark Fury became the spearhead of the operation, its hull patched and reinforced, a symbol of humanity's defiance. As the fleet prepared for the long journey into the heart of Zarvok space, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty among the crew. The risks were enormous. Their chances of survival were slim, but no one on the Dark Fury was about to back down. Vance addressed his crew one last time before they left. This is it. This is humanity's last chance, he said, his voice booming across the comms. We may not have the numbers, and we may not have the luxury of time, but we have something the Zarvok don't, the will to fight, to never give up. We fight for every last breath we have, for every last soul that's been lost, for every last drop of blood spilled. We fight because this is our home, and we're not letting it fall. The fleet, battered but unbroken, launched into the vast unknown. Their destination was the heart of enemy territory, the place where they could either bring an end to the war or seal humanity's doom. The journey to the Zerath Nexus was tense and slow. They had to navigate through enemy-controlled space, avoiding detection at all costs. The closer they got, the more desperate the stakes became. Vance kept his crew focused, reminding them that every successful raid, every victory so far, had been a step closer to crippling the Zarvok. We make it to the Nexus, Vance said, and we break their hold over the galaxy. We hit them where it hurts. And when we're done, they'll regret the day they ever crossed humanity. But deep inside, Vance knew that the real battle had not even begun. As the fleet approached the Zerath Nexus, the sensors began to light up with signs of immense activity. The Zarvok were ready. They had fortified their capital to an unimaginable degree, and the human fleet would face their strongest defenses yet. Vance's voice echoed across the comms again, steely and resolute. We're not stopping now. No matter what happens, we finish what we started. The time for retreat had passed. The final assault had begun. The Dark Fury and the rest of humanity's fleet emerged from the deepest reaches of space, creeping toward the Zerath Nexus. The dense star system was surrounded by layers of Zarvok defenses, hidden minefields, anti-stealth radars, and fleets of warships that would make any other species hesitate. But humanity had no choice but to press forward. Approaching the outer defense perimeter, Grayson's voice broke the silence in the command room, his fingers flying over his console. They've deployed 3 fleets to guard the Nexus itself, and more are en route. We've got one shot at this. Vance's eyes were focused on the tactical readout, his face hard as stone. We won't need more than one shot. We hit them fast and hard. Make them question everything they've built. The fleet's approach was agonizingly slow, as they fought against their own fear. The silence of space was unbearable, but it gave them no room for doubt. They had come too far to turn back now. Every ship, every captain, every officer knew what was at stake. Haywood stood beside Vance, her arms crossed. I don't like the odds, but I trust you. We're committed. Vance gave her a sharp nod. Then let's make them regret this war. The first phase of the attack was designed to throw the Zarvok off balance, striking without warning. As the fleet broke into the outermost rings of the Nexus, their presence was detected almost immediately. The Zarvok were quick to respond, launching a barrage of missiles and deploying drone swarms to intercept the human ships. We're going to have to fight our way in, Riker growled, gripping the armrests of his command chair. His voice was thick with both frustration and determination. If we don't punch through their front lines, we won't get another chance. Vance's face remained impassive. Then we punch. The Dark Fury roared forward, its weapons unleashed in a coordinated assault. The fleet followed, each ship targeting key enemy formations. The opening strike was brutal, ripping through the first wave of Zarvok drones and warships with devastating force. But it quickly became clear the enemy was ready. A massive explosion rippled across the void as a Zarvok destroyer detonated from a direct hit, but within seconds, 2 more appeared in its place. Reinforcements arrived faster than expected, and the overwhelming number of enemy ships threatened to swallow humanity's fleet. We're not making enough of an impact, Grayson reported, his voice tinged with frustration. They're reinforcing faster than we can dismantle them. Vance's eyes scanned the battlefield, calculating, analyzing. Then he turned to Haywood. Prepare the Fury's auxiliary weapons. We're going to make them regret underestimating us. The Dark Fury shifted course abruptly, darting toward the nearest Zarvok command ship, a massive, sleek structure that pulsed with dark energy. As the ship barreled through the asteroid field, a dozen smaller enemy ships peeled off to intercept, firing relentless barrages of plasma cannons. Vance gripped the controls tightly, his mind working in overdrive. Set the coordinates for the main reactor. We'll hit them there. Haywood didn't hesitate. She understood the plan immediately. They would get in close, overload the Dark Fury's reactor, and detonate it at the heart of the enemy's fleet. Coordinates locked, she said, her hands flying over the console. The Dark Fury streaked across the battlefield, dodging fire and weaving through exploding debris. The air in the command room was thick with tension as the ship surged forward, taking heavy damage from the Zarvok's weapons, but still holding strong. Then, with a deafening roar, the Dark Fury slammed into the heart of the enemy formation, unleashing everything they had. Energy pulses blasted from every weapons platform, overloading shields and tearing through the Zarvok ship like paper. The ship was now a target, a decoy, a signal for the fleet to follow. The plan was simple. Overload their reactor, create a chain reaction that would cripple the Zarvok forces, and give humanity a chance to break through the outer defenses. The Dark Fury's reactor started to build energy in a violent crescendo, each moment ticking down to the inevitable. But just as the countdown reached its final moments, the unthinkable happened. A massive Zarvok battleship, larger and more menacing than anything humanity had encountered, dropped from the fold to space. The Vexum, the ultimate war machine, the flagship of the Zarvok Dominion, appeared at the front lines with weapons blazing. It was an unstoppable force. Its armor was nearly impervious, and its cannons could obliterate entire fleets with a single shot. "Retreat," Riker shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "We're outmatched. We're not ready for this." But Vance's expression remained hard. He had anticipated this moment. The Zarvok were smart. They would realize the danger and deploy their final weapon. "We're not running," Vance said, voice resolute. "Not now. Not when we're so close." The Vexum's first salvo blasted through the Dark Fury shields, knocking the ship into a tumble. For a moment, it seemed as if all hope was lost. But Vance never wavered. He had made his decision long before this moment. "Activate the reactor now," he ordered, knowing full well the consequences. Haywood's hands flew across the controls. Activating. Now. The Dark Fury's reactor, overloaded with energy, unleashed a pulse of light, so bright it could have blinded the stars themselves. The shock waves sent ripples through the battlefield, overwhelming the Vexum's systems just as it had with the smaller ships. The flagship's shields flickered and collapsed, its engines faltering. With the Vexum temporarily disabled, Vance's fleet surged forward, pouring all firepower into the already weakened battleship. It was a desperate gamble, but it worked. The Vexum's core collapsed under the barrage, its final scream echoing through the void before it disintegrated into 1,000 burning pieces. Humanity's fleet had struck at the heart of the Zarvok Dominion. But the battle was far from over. As the remnants of the Vexum were swallowed by space, Vance surveyed the battlefield. The fight had not been won, but a massive blow had been dealt to the Zarvok, perhaps one they could not recover from. Their capital was in chaos, their warships scattered. Vance stood, breathing heavily, his gaze locked onto the horizon. "We've taken down their flagship," he said, his voice low. "But we're not done. Now, we finish what we started. We'll bring the war to their doorstep." The next phase of the fight was about to begin. The aftermath of the Vexum's destruction rippled through the Zarvok fleet like a shockwave. For the first time in the war, the Zarvok were on the back foot, disoriented, their command structure fractured, their largest and most formidable ship reduced to space debris. But while the immediate victory was significant, it was also a poison chalice. Humanity's fleet had delivered a mortal blow, but it had come at a devastating cost. Vance stood at the command center of the Dark Fury, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze distant. The ship had taken heavy damage, its hull barely holding together after the reactor overload. The damage to their systems was extensive, and it would take days, if not weeks, to fully repair. More critically, the fleet had lost several more ships in the assault. The human losses were mounting, and supplies were running dangerously low. "Captain," Haywood said, her voice laced with concern as she stepped into the room, "our fleet scattered. Some ships didn't make it out of the fight, and those that did are barely functional. We're in no condition to fight again, certainly not without major repairs and resupplies." Vance didn't look at her. His mind was already racing through their next steps. "I know, but we don't have the luxury of time. The Zarvok are reorganizing. They'll call in reinforcements from their core systems, and this sector will be crawling with ships soon." Grayson's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain, the damage to the Dark Fury is critical. We're patched up enough to fly, but we'll need to get to a repair facility, or we'll be dead in space." Vance exhaled sharply. "I know. But first, we need to finish what we started. We need to take out their command center in the Nexus." Haywood raised an eyebrow, incredulous. "Vance, you're talking about going into the heart of Zarvok territory with a half-dead fleet. We're running on fumes." "We're not going into the heart of Zarvok space," Vance replied, his voice sharp. "We're going to strike their capital, the nerve center of their operations, before they can regroup. They may be powerful, but they're vulnerable right now. They're reeling, and we have to push that advantage." Riker's voice came through next, his tone grim but determined. "He's right. If we wait for the Zarvok to recover, they'll be even harder to beat. They're used to crushing their enemies by sheer force. But they're not ready for us to fight like this, like we've got nothing to lose." There was a moment of silence as Vance's officers absorbed the gravity of his words. It was a last-ditch effort, a desperate gamble, but they had come this far. To stop now was unthinkable. Humanity had made its stand, and they couldn't afford to let the Zarvok retake the initiative. "We've lost too much already," Vance said. "We're not backing down. We go to the Nexus, now." The fleet limped toward the heart of the Zerath Nexus, moving as quickly as their damaged ships could manage. It was a race against time. The longer they took, the more reinforcements the Zarvok could call in. Their space was vast and heavily fortified, but Vance's plan was simple. Infiltrate the capital, destroy the central command hub, and leave the Zarvok scrambling for leadership. They would strike fast, hard, and without mercy. As a fleet neared the outskirts of the Zerath Nexus, they encountered heavy resistance. The Zarvok were no fools. They had regrouped and were now deploying wave after wave of warships, desperately trying to keep the humans at bay. But Vance's fleet was ready. "We're hitting them hard and fast." "No holding back," Vance ordered. The battle was chaotic. Waves of Zarvok ships swarmed in from every angle, their weapons flashing through the blackness of space. Human ships darted and weaved, firing in bursts of deadly precision, striking key targets with surgical accuracy. But despite the fury of their assault, the Zarvok's sheer numbers were overwhelming. The Dark Fury fought alongside its comrades, launching salvo after salvo, tearing through the front lines of the Zarvok defenses. Explosions lit up the dark expanse as enemy ships disintegrated under their fire. But every victory came with a price. The human fleet was losing ships. The enemy's counterattacks were relentless. Yet still, humanity pressed on, refusing to surrender even in the face of certain annihilation. "Captain, we breached the perimeter," Haywood said, voice tight with concentration. "We're in the system. We've got a clear path to their central command center." Vance's eyes were fierce. "Keep pushing forward. We're going all the way." In the heart of the Nexus, the central command hub loomed, a sprawling citadel of steel and energy, surrounded by a gauntlet of enemy ships and defense platforms. The air inside the Dark Fury was thick with tension as they drew closer. "This is it," Riker said, his voice low. "The endgame. If we take this out, they won't be able to coordinate. They'll be blind." "That's the plan," Vance said, his voice cold and resolute. "But we're going in hot. No slowing down now." As they neared the command center, the full force of the Zarvok fleet descended on them, cutting off their escape routes. It was clear the enemy knew what was coming. They were ready for a fight to the bitter end. "We're going to make it count," Vance muttered under his breath, watching as the vast network of enemy ships surrounded them. "Give them everything we've got." The final push was brutal. Ships exploded in every direction as human and Zarvok forces clashed in a deadly maelstrom. The Dark Fury weaved through the chaos, its cannons cutting through enemy lines as it pushed forward, drawing closer to the heart of the Nexus. The massive command center came into view, a fortress of metal, bristling with defense turrets and shields. The Dark Fury's targeting system locked onto its core. "This is it," Vance said. "Take the shot." A series of precise blasts tore through the enemy shields, each shot a calculated strike aimed at the heart of the command center. The space around them became a swirling maelstrom of destruction as the human fleet poured every ounce of firepower into the Nexus. Finally, with a thunderous explosion, the command center erupted in a storm of fire and debris. The massive fortress disintegrated before their eyes, sending shockwaves through the surrounding enemy fleets. "Command center destroyed," Grayson said, his voice laced with exhaustion. "We did it." But Vance knew the war was far from over. The Nexus was only one piece of the puzzle. The Zarvok were a massive empire, and they would regroup. But for now, humanity had struck a blow that could not be ignored. The command center was down. The war had shifted. "Let's finish what we started," Vance said quietly. Humanity's fleet, battered and scarred, began their retreat, but they left a galaxy forever changed behind them. The destruction of the Zarvok command center sent shockwaves through their entire empire. Across the vastness of their dominion, from the core worlds to the fringes of their space, the message was clear. Humanity had struck at the heart of the Zarvok war machine and wounded them deeply. The central command that coordinated their fleet movements and resources was no more. Their strategic infrastructure had crumbled. But with their leaderless forces in disarray, the Zarvok were now more dangerous than ever. The retreat of humanity's fleet from the Zerath Nexus was barely more than a tactical repositioning. The mission had been a success, but the cost had been immense. The Dark Fury and the remaining ships of the human fleet limped through space, battered by battle, their resources drained. The victory had come at a steep price. Nearly half their fleet had been destroyed, and the rest barely functional. Vance stood in the war room of the Dark Fury, looking over the holographic map of the galaxy. The words victory flashed across the screen in bold, but the victory felt hollow. The war was far from over. The Zarvok will come for us. They'll regroup, rebuild, and they won't stop until we're wiped out, Haywood said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. But now we're on their radar. We've drawn their full attention. Vance's gaze never left the map. He wasn't concerned with that. He had already anticipated the retaliation. The Zarvok would retaliate, yes, but they would be divided, weakened, unsure of their next move. The command center was just the beginning. We're not running from them, Vance said. The Zarvok are an empire built on control. We've disrupted that control. Now we turn the tables on them. We take the fight to their doorstep. The Dark Fury's crew worked around the clock, repairing the damaged ship and patching together what remained of their resources. They would need more than what they had left if they were going to continue this war. But Vance refused to give in to the grim realities of their situation. I want all remaining ships to report back here, he ordered. We've disrupted the Zarvok. Now we finish what we started. They've been controlling the galaxy with an iron fist. Let's give them a taste of what it feels like to be hunted. With a renewed sense of purpose, the fleet, despite its diminished numbers, set its course toward the core worlds of the Zarvok Dominion. It was a dangerous move, and the odds of survival were slim. Yet, Vance knew there was no other choice. The Zarvok would crush any force that dared rise up against them. But humanity had just proven they were capable of far more than the Zarvok had expected. The first wave of Zarvok retaliation came swiftly. A massive fleet of warships, spearheaded by newly commissioned dreadnoughts, emerged from the shadows of their industrial worlds. The human fleet, still licking its wounds from the battle in the Zerath Nexus, was barely in position to defend itself when the first barrage of missiles hit. Shields holding, but barely, Grayson shouted, his voice full of tension as the Dark Fury took another hit. The hull groaned under the pressure, and alarms blared throughout the ship. Vance's face was a study in calm determination. We've been outnumbered from the start. Let them throw everything they've got at us. We'll fight until there's nothing left to fight for. But today, they're not just fighting humans. They're fighting against the will to survive. The fleet engaged in a brutal exchange of fire with the incoming Zarvok warships. Explosions lit up the blackness of space, and the human ships, despite their technological advancements, were beginning to show signs of strain. Yet, humanity fought with a ferocity the Zarvok had not expected. Then, Vance gave the order. Retreat. The word struck like a hammer. But it wasn't a defeatist retreat. It was a calculated maneuver. The human fleet pulled back into a nearby nebula, using the dense cloud to shield them from the heavier enemy fire. Their pursuers, overconfident in their victory, charged forward, expecting to wipe out the remnants of the human fleet. That's when the trap was sprung. The Dark Fury and the remaining ships of the human fleet launched a surprise counterattack from the nebula, flanking the lead Zarvok ships. Their first salvo caught the enemy off guard, their shields already depleted from the initial battle. The Zarvok fleet faltered, caught in the pincer move. Humanity's fleet was smaller, weaker, but their tactics were sharper, honed by necessity. The ensuing battle was chaotic. But when the dust cleared, it was clear that humanity had once again dealt the Zarvok a crushing blow. Their command vessels, though massive, were not invincible. We've done it again, Haywood said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She had seen the devastation in the wake of the battle, the bodies of the fallen comrades, the wreckage of their once proud ships. Vance looked at the still smoking remains of the enemy fleet, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. Not done yet, he said. But the Zarvok are starting to feel it. We've taken their best shot and turned it back at them. We've made them bleed. After the battle, humanity's fleet, what remained of it, took a moment to regroup. Their victory was a fleeting one. Though they had broken the Zarvok's offensive, Vance knew they had no time to rest. They couldn't afford it. They won't stop coming, Riker said. But we've done what we needed to. We've shattered their sense of invincibility. Now, we need to exploit that. Vance nodded, his mind already working on the next step. We hit them where it hurts the most. We go after their industrial worlds, the ones supplying the bulk of their war machines. If we destroy their capacity to produce weapons, we destroy their war effort. They'll have no more ships, no more soldiers, and no more way to fight us. Vance was standing on the bridge, gazing out into the vast unknown of space, when he felt the weight of the moment. Humanity had come a long way since the first skirmishes with the Zarvok. But now, they had a chance, a real chance to turn the tide of the war. It wasn't going to be easy. The Zarvok would come back harder, faster, and more desperate. But humanity had one advantage they didn't: sheer willpower. The will to survive. "We'll make it," Vance muttered under his breath, staring at the flickering stars in front of him. "We'll finish this." The next phase of the war was about to begin. Humanity had found its rhythm. It was no longer fighting on the defensive. They were fighting to win. And the Zarvok, despite their immense power, had just begun to realize that fighting humans was a far more dangerous prospect than they had ever anticipated. The galaxy had changed in the wake of humanity's audacious victories against the Zarvok. Each battle, no matter how costly, had pushed the once imposing empire to the brink. The Zarvok had always believed their dominance was invulnerable. But humanity's ruthlessness in battle, their ability to adapt and strike in ways the Zarvok never expected, had cracked their facade of invincibility. The time had come to shift the tide of the war. The Zarvok's greatest strength was their industrial might, the forge worlds, the enormous, heavily fortified planets where their war machines were built, repaired, and deployed. These planets were the lifeblood of the Zarvok war effort, and the humans' mission was clear: cripple the enemy's capacity to fight by taking down their production centers. Vance's voice echoed through the Dark Fury's command room, steely and unyielding. "We've bled them, but we haven't broken them yet. Their forge worlds are the key. If we take them out, they'll have no way to replenish their fleet. We won't stop until they're on their knees." Haywood, looking over the schematics of the Zarvok worlds, nodded sharply. "We'll be facing heavy resistance. These planets are their most fortified positions. But if we can get in and destroy their primary factories, it'll cripple them. They won't recover for years." Riker's voice came next, deep with a mix of confidence and apprehension. "We've survived against overwhelming odds before. We do it again. We hit them fast, hard, and ruthless." Vance's expression was cold, resolute. "We've been fighting for survival from the start. This isn't just about taking their worlds. This is about ending the war. We break their production. We break their empire." The first forge world was called Koroth, a volcanic planet surrounded by a thick cloud of defense platforms, mines, and weaponized satellites. The human fleet, battered but still determined, arrived under the cover of a small asteroid field. The Dark Fury and the other ships moved in cautiously, knowing that one misstep could mean the end of their mission. "Scanners are showing multiple defense arrays around the planet," Grayson reported from his station, his voice steady but cautious. "It's going to be a tight window to get in undetected." Vance's voice cut through the tension. "We won't be undetected. We can't afford to be. Our best shot is to punch through their defenses and hit them where it counts, right at the factories. No hesitation." The plan was dangerous. The human fleet would need to break through the defenses and strike the core of the planet's industrial complex. They didn't have the firepower to take out the entire planet, but they had enough to do devastating damage to the Zarvok's production lines. The challenge would be getting in close enough to hit the heart of the operation without being obliterated by the planet's defenses. The Dark Fury led the charge, its weapons blazing as it made its way toward the surface. Explosions erupted all around them as the first waves of missiles and defense drones launched from the planet's orbit. The human ships scattered, evading enemy fire while returning the assault with everything they had. "We're taking heavy fire," Riker shouted. "Shields are holding, but just barely." "We have to make it to the industrial zones," Vance growled. "Keep pushing forward. We're not backing down now." The battle was fierce and unrelenting as they cut through the outer defense rings. The human fleet, relying on precision strikes and quick maneuvers, tore through the first wave of defenses. But the deeper they went, the more intense the resistance became. The Zarvok knew they were coming. They had anticipated this strike, and they were prepared. The Dark Fury took several hits, its hull groaning under the weight of the incoming fire. But the crew didn't falter. They had a mission to complete, and nothing, not even the relentless firepower of the Zarvok, was going to stop them. Focus on the core reactors, Vance barked. We hit them hard there, and we'll knock out the entire production grid. As the human ships pushed forward, they began to close in on their target, the massive industrial complex that stretched across the planet's surface like a living thing. The core reactors of the planet's primary factory were located deep within the complex, and once destroyed, they would send a chain reaction through the entire system. But the deeper they moved, the fiercer the resistance became. The Zarvok brought out their heavy artillery, deploying massive warships and defense platforms directly above the complex. "Captain, we've got incoming," Grayson shouted, his hands dancing over the controls. "They're deploying their main assault forces to intercept us. It's now or never." Vance's voice was unwavering. "Give them everything we've got. We won't let up until this planet burns." With one final push, the Dark Fury and its remaining fleet barreled through the last layer of defenses. As the ship plunged into the heart of the industrial complex, Vance's pulse quickened. The core reactors were just ahead. "Prepare for maximum firepower," Vance yelled. The Dark Fury's weapons came to life, sending devastating blasts into the heart of the complex. Explosions lit up the sky, and the once impenetrable factories began to collapse under the weight of the assault. But the planet was not giving up without a fight. From the darkness above, the Zarvok unleashed their final weapon, a massive warship, far larger and more heavily armed than any they had yet encountered. The Vecthan, the flagship of the Forge Worlds, descended into the fray. Its weapons flashed with deadly intent, launching a barrage of missiles that slammed into the human fleet. The Dark Fury took a hit, its shields failing under the sheer force of the impact. The ship shuddered, the hull groaning as the crew fought to keep it intact. "Shields failing, Captain," Haywood reported. "We need to pull back, or we're done." Vance's eyes burned with resolve. "We don't pull back. Not now. Not when we're so close." With a roar of engines, the Dark Fury surged forward, now fully committed to the final assault. The warship's cannons unleashed everything they had in a massive barrage aimed at the Vecthan. The enemy flagship returned fire, but it was too late. The Dark Fury's weapons found their mark, blasting through the Vecthan's shields and tearing into its core. The battle was brutal, but humanity's determination was unstoppable. In a flash, the Vecthan erupted in a fiery explosion, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. With the enemy flagship destroyed, the remaining Zarvok ships were quickly overwhelmed. The human fleet focused all firepower on the remaining targets, reducing the industrial complex to rubble. The explosion sent shockwaves rippling across the planet, and soon, the Forge world of Karath was nothing more than a crater-riddled shell, its once bustling factories and war machines reduced to smoldering ruins. The victory was hard-won, and the cost had been high. But as the final remnants of the Zarvok fleet retreated, Vance knew that this was a turning point in the war. The Zarvok were no longer an unstoppable juggernaut. They were fractured, wounded, and desperate. Humanity had delivered the blow that would change the course of the war. As the fleet regrouped in the aftermath of the battle, the scars of the fight were clear. The ships were battered, their crews exhausted. But Vance stood tall, his gaze fixed on the stars ahead. "We've crippled them," Vance said. The destruction of the Forge world Karath sent a tremor through the Zarvok Empire that could be felt across the galaxy. The loss was catastrophic. Not only had humanity crippled their primary production hub, but they had proven that no target was safe, no matter how heavily fortified. The once indomitable Zarvok Empire was now a shadow of its former self, its war machine gutted and struggling to rebuild. But even in their weakened state, the Zarvok were far from defeated. They still had vast fleets scattered across the galaxy, and their resolve to crush humanity had only deepened. With their production lines shattered, they were forced to rely on desperation tactics and their most loyal commanders. Vance stood at the bridge of the Dark Fury, looking over the star systems ahead. The fleet was severely depleted, their numbers down to only a fraction of what they had once been. But their purpose had never been clearer. The end of the war was within reach. "Captain, we've received intelligence from the Resistance," Haywood reported, her voice tense. "The Zarvok are rallying their remaining fleets. They've gathered a coalition of their most elite forces for one final strike. They're massing near the border of their home system. The capital is the last stronghold, and they plan to use everything they've got to protect it." Vance's expression hardened. "They're not going to make it easy, but we have no choice. We take the fight to their doorstep once and for all." The final battle was approaching, and Vance knew that if they failed now, all their sacrifices would have been for nothing. The decision had been made. Humanity would go to the heart of the Zarvok Empire, and they would make their stand at the gates of the capital world, Zarvok Prime. The journey to the Zarvok capital was fraught with danger. Their path was littered with traps, ambushes, minefields, and relentless pursuers. Yet, for every ambush the Zarvok set, the humans countered with brutal efficiency, catching the enemy off guard, dismantling their forces, and pushing forward with a single-minded determination. But it wasn't without loss. Each engagement took its toll. The Dark Fury had been hit again, its systems barely holding together. The crew was tired, but they were also the strongest they had ever been, united by the belief that the war was coming to a close. "We've reached the edge of Zarvok Prime system," Grayson said, his voice steady but laced with a tension that was palpable. "The enemy's waiting for us. Their final fleet is massive, Captain. They're ready to give everything to stop us." "Good," Vance replied. "We'll give them a fight they'll never forget. This ends now." The final confrontation came like a storm. The Zarvok's flagship, the Zarkoroth, a monstrous dreadnought that had been their symbol of power, led the charge. It was an intimidating sight, its hulking silhouette casting a shadow over the entire battle space as it advanced toward the human fleet. But humanity had learned to fight smarter, to use their smaller numbers to their advantage. The Dark Fury and its remaining ships maneuvered through the chaos, striking precisely when and where the Zarvok least expected. The battle unfolded in brutal waves. The human ships fought with the fury of those who had lost so much. The Zarvok's might was overwhelming, but it was no longer unchallenged. Each of their warships that fell only seemed to fuel the fire within the human fleet. "We're in the thick of it now," Riker said, his voice almost drowned out by the blaring alarms. "But we can't let up. We've got to hit them where it hurts." Vance's eyes burned with intensity as he watched the unfolding battle. "Target the Zarkoroth. That's their last line of defense. We take that down, and their fleet will fall apart." The human fleet surged toward the enemy dreadnought. A torrential exchange of firepower lit up the expanse of space. Zarvok ships exploded in brilliant flashes, but the Zarkoroth remained a formidable fortress. It retaliated with devastating weaponry, sending torrents of plasma bolts into the human fleet. "Shields at 30%, Grayson reported. "We can't take many more hits like that." Vance's grip on the armrest tightened. "Hold steady. We push through." The Dark Fury darted through the chaos, cutting a swath through the enemy lines. The Zarkoroth unleashed a full broadside, its weapons lighting up the sky, but it was no match for the fury of a desperate crew. Humanity's fleet was taking more damage, but the mission was clear. If they wanted to end the war, they had to destroy the flagship. "We're in range. Now, Captain," Haywood asked, her hands hovering over the controls. "Now," Vance said, his voice steady, filled with the certainty of victory. "Fire." The barrage from the Dark Fury and the remaining fleet slammed into the Zarkoroth with brutal precision. The mighty dreadnought's shields flickered and faltered, its weapons falling silent as it was pounded by wave after wave of human firepower. Then, with a massive explosion, the Zarkoroth crumpled, its core detonating in a spectacular burst of light. The destruction of the flagship sent shockwaves through the Zarvok fleet. Their coordination fractured. Their will to fight crumbled. The human fleet pressed the attack, no longer fighting to survive, but to win. The remaining Zarvok ships, leaderless and scattered, were quickly overwhelmed. The aftermath of the final battle left the human fleet battered and broken, but victorious. The Zarkarath was destroyed. The heart of the Zarvok Empire had been pierced. Vance stood on the bridge of the Dark Fury, his eyes scanning the remnants of the once feared Zarvok fleet. "We did it," Haywood said, her voice soft with disbelief. "We really did it." Vance's expression softened, but there was no time for celebration. The war was over, but the galaxy would not be the same. The Zarvok were defeated, their empire shattered. Humanity had won, against the odds, against a much larger foe. But the scars of the war would remain, and the price of victory was steep. Vance looked out at the void, his mind already turning to the future. "This is just the beginning. We've earned our place in the galaxy. Now we rebuild." The Dark Fury slowly drifted through the remnants of the battle, its hull scarred and battered, but still standing. Humanity had emerged victorious, but the true test of their strength was only just beginning. The galaxy, now free from the shadow of the Zarvok, would need new leaders, new voices, and new purpose. But Vance knew one thing for certain. The galaxy would never again look down on humanity. They had been tested, and they had proven something that no one could ever deny. Humanity's fighters were the most ruthless the galaxy had ever seen. And no empire, no matter how vast, could ever take that from them.